Hi, my name is Maya Michelson, Deputy Director of Operations, and thanks so much for joining me for Financial Document Review for Panelists. First off, thanks so much for serving as a panelist this year. It's an unusual year for both our applicants and our panelists, to say the least, in preparing for these panels. Some of our applicants have been able to successfully pivot, and their submitted materials may reflect that reality. And some may have gone into partial hibernation as they've worked to figure out what comes next and every iteration of that in between. And that's why our application process and our review process both look very different this year. We're all in the process of figuring out what comes next for the arts sector. We really appreciate everyone making the adjustments needed to make sure that grant funds awarded are as impactful as possible. Now, before we deep dive into financial document review, let me first ask you to think of a grant application like a story. Every part of the application is a chapter of that story, from the narrative questions to the web links to financial documents. And when read together, they should provide an understanding about how an organization operates, how it embodies the artistic experience, and how it engages with its community. So here's a pro tip. Before you begin the financial document review, read the other sections of the application first. Scan for clues for what you might expect to find in the financial document review. Some questions to ask yourself might be, does this seem to be a largely volunteer-run organizational applicant? That could impact how they generate revenue, more emphasis on ticket sales versus fundraising, for example. Does this applicant own or operate a facility? If so, expect to see some stresses, especially for smaller organizations as they juggle keeping facilities operating while also seeing significantly less income generated. Conversely, for small organizations without a facility and with an all-volunteer staff, their overhead might be low, which could minimize the negative impact to a degree. Does this applicant mention great successes or challenges in either revenue or expense areas in the current year that you might expect to see reflected in financial documents? Does the applicant indicate that board activity is decreased? If so, how's that reflected in the financials? Might mean decreased revenue resulting from a less engaged board in, say, fundraising or ticket sales. On the flip side, does the applicant indicate that the board is firing on all cylinders? If so, you might see more evidence of fundraising and so on in the financials. Does the narrative indicate activity revenue projections for next year that are significantly stronger than the current year? And have they articulated a strategy or rationale for those projections? If the applicant indicates they do not yet have pandemic planning for financial sustainability in place, take special note of the narrative. Does the narrative seem to be firmly rooted in the present moment, or is it full of wishful thinking? Other information might present itself in the application questions that you might expect or want to read more about in the financial document review, so make a note of it. Now, on to the financial document review. Note we're calling it a review, not an assessment or an appraisal or an evaluation. We're asking you to review the financial documents submitted as a peer and not as a CPA. And just let us know if either you see something concerning that you would suggest we follow up on, or that there simply isn't enough or the right kind of information provided for you to make a determination. You'll have the opportunity to make suggestions or comments on what additional financials or additional narrative is needed to the IEC during the panel process. That'll help us understand the story of this applicant. So what have applicants provided for the financial document review? They should have provided a document that's comprised of two parts in this order: an income and expense statement, fondly known as a profit and loss or P&L, and a statement of financial position, fondly known as a balance sheet. Note that sometimes applicants don't put together documents in the order we've asked for with the information we asked for because, well, people don't always follow instructions. But we're gonna give them a little grace because we've all made a mistake like that. Take a look at the financial document they've provided. and start with the income and expense statement. It should have several columns: the FY20 budget, the FY20 actual, the FY21 budget, and the FY21 year-end projection. But here's a really important thing to keep in mind. It's for their fiscal year, which they provide just before the document is uploaded. You should expect to see some differences between the FY20 budget and the FY20 actual because of, well, the pandemic. But where you might expect to see more significant differences would be between the FY20 budget and the FY21 budget, because it reflects more or less a full fiscal year of pandemic arts management. If you see significant difference between the FY21 budget and the FY21 projection, numbers are significantly less related to income or more related to expenditures, that might warrant a further look or a request for more information by us later. There are some cases where the FY21 budget and projections are exactly the same or very close to the same because an organization's fiscal year started in January of 2021 and they submitted their financial documents in February or March of 2021. So not enough time has passed in their projections to have shifted them much at all. You might see a deficit in net income for FY20 or FY21. That's understandable given the circumstances. We're in a pandemic after all. Does that seem extreme or concerning in any way? If yes, you'll want to pay particular attention to the balance sheet. We'll talk about that in just a second, and factor in whether or not they have a paid staff or they own or operate a facility. Conversely, you might, surprise, surprise, see a surplus for an applicant in their profit and loss in either year. That's great and just fine for review purposes. This grant program does not fund based on need, so we don't penalize those organizations that are able to run at a net profit. So when looking at individual lines of a budget, this is where your review of other sections of the application really come into play. Did the applicant describe strategies or actions that might explain higher ticket sales projections? Maybe they moved to a better ticket sales platform or lower rent costs, for example. Perhaps they negotiated lower rent from their landlord. And lastly, obviously, it was impossible for applicants to know what pandemic restrictions were going to be in place when they developed their FY21 budget, and certainly what the rest of this fiscal year is going to look like and what next fiscal year is going to look like as it relates to how attendance and participation would be restricted. So don't be concerned if an applicant's financials show hopeful optimism, but do make note if they show wild exuberance and really magical thinking. So let's move on to the statement of financial position. It's called the statement of financial position because it helps the reviewer see, in standard accounting format, the organization's financial position in a specific moment in time. The assets number and the liabilities and equity number should be identical, i.e. in balance. If they aren't, it's rare, but it happens, you'll want to make a note of that. Now, take a closer look at the assets category. Take a look at total current assets. Those are the assets that are most liquid. In other words, an organization can more easily liquidate them to meet obligations. Note whether or not there are any accounts receivable. In other words, funds that are owed to the organization. Accounts receivable would also be listed under current assets. A very low dollar figure under total current assets might send up a red flag. Now let's move on to liabilities. Take a look at current liabilities. Liabilities are what the organization currently owes. A very high dollar amount here might send up a red flag. So that's it for financial review. Now that wasn't that bad, was it? Remember, anything you see in your financial review that gives you pause, make a note of it to share with your fellow panelists. The public panel review time is your opportunity to pose questions and suggest where any additional information is needed, if any, to tell the full story of this applicant. Thanks again so much. Thanks again for being a panelist. We really appreciate it.